Welcome to the NEMA Field Representative Training Program. My name is Megan Hayes and I am the NEMA Technical Director for Operations. Today's presentation covers the NEMA 250 standard for enclosures for electrical equipment up to 1000 volts. Before we start, here's a brief introduction of the speakers on today's presentation. Each of the 4 field representatives is a master electrician and former electrical inspector. Mike?
My name is Mike Stone. I am the West Coast field rep. I cover the 11 Western states, including Alaska and Hawaii, and I'm based out of Northern California. I've been with NEMA for 8 years, and prior to that, I was an AHJ for several different jurisdictions on the central coast of California for 25 years.
Hello, my name is Tim McClintock, and I am the Midwest field representative. I cover 17 states in the Midwestern U.S. I'm headquartered in the state of Ohio and have been with NEMA since last September. Prior to joining NEMA, I worked for 8 years at the NFPA as a regional electrical code specialist, and before that, worked for 16 years as an inspector in Wayne County in the state of Ohio.
Hello, my name is Brian Holland, and I am the Southern Region Field Representative. I cover 11 states in the Southeast United States and 2 U.S. territories. I am currently headquartered in the state of Florida, and I've been with NEMA for 6 years.
Hello, my name is Jack Lyons. I'm the Northeast Field Representative. I cover the states on the screen from Pennsylvania up to Maine. My office is in Massachusetts, and I've been with NEMA for over 7 years now.
The National Electrical Manufacturers Association created a standard rating system for electrical enclosures that defines specific environmental applications in which an electrical enclosure can be used. This environmental rating type system is a convenient way to combine a series of prescriptive and performance construction and testing criteria under one product identifier.
So NEMA 250 is a 55-page performance standard, and it's currently on the 2018 edition. The standard outlines 16 rating types using a combination of 13 numbers and letters. These rating types include indoor locations, outdoor locations, environments requiring dust-tight applications, and enclosures for hazardous locations, specifically Class 1, Division 1, and Class 2, Division 1 locations. Next. NEMA 250 was first published in 1979, but was based on nearly 100 years of enclosure standards development at both NEMA and underwriters' laboratories. The earliest document covering requirements for electrical enclosures was UL 50 way back in 1916. This standard recognized the shift from open mounted equipment on slate or porcelain backboards to enclosed equipment in cabinets and boxes. Early enclosure makers were literally cabinet makers and essentially constructed furniture around equipment. Later standards included UL 508, NEMA IS 1.1, and NEMA Engineering Bulletin 60. Today, NEMA 250, UL 50, and UL 508A have been fully harmonized. Next. While NEMA 250 is where environmental rating types got their start, the rating system has now been incorporated in many other codes and standards associated with electrical enclosures. The most prominent use of NEMA enclosure types is in the NFPA 70 National Electrical Code. Next. Section 110.28 enclosure types and Table 110.28 enclosure selection is a reflection of NEMA 250. Enclosure ratings were first listed in Section 430.91 of the 1984 edition of the National Electrical Code, but was eventually moved to Section 110.20 in the 2008 NEC. Unlike NEMA 250, Section 110.28 of the NEC does not include hazardous locations. Next. The term environmental refers to conditions that may be detrimental to the enclosed equipment. This has established the concept of suitability. An enclosure suitable for the environmental conditions that are present means that it can protect the enclosed equipment from potential damage. Environmental conditions are not just weather related, but also refer to building operation and processes where electrical equipment may be exposed to foreign materials. Terms related to environmental conditions will be defined later in the presentation. Also refer to the informational notes to Table 11028 for additional guidance on common terms to describe environmental suitability. Next. This is Table 2.1 of the NEMA 250, which outlines enclosure ratings for indoor locations only. The table lists 10 enclosure types under 11 environmental conditions. Please note that no single enclosure rating is suitable for all 11 conditions. Therefore, it may be necessary to consider ancillary ratings or multiple type enclosure ratings, which will be discussed later in the presentation. Next. This is Table 2.2 in the NEMA 250, which outlines enclosure ratings for both indoor and outdoor locations. The table lists 10 enclosure types and 10 environmental conditions. Table 2.1 and 2.2 are closely aligned with Table 11028 of the NEC. An X marked in the column below the enclosure type indicates it will protect against the condition listed in that row. For example, a NEMA 3R enclosure will protect against access to hazardous parts, the ingress of solid foreign objects such as falling dirt, the ingress of water such as dripping and light splashing, and the ingress of water from rain, snow, and sleet. However, a 3RX enclosure would be required to additionally protect against corrosive agents. Next.
So all of the enclosure types, one thing that all of them do is they provide a degree of protection to personnel against incidental contact with the enclosed live equipment. And so here's a truth. Most people will eventually try to stick something conductive into a hole in a strange looking enclosure. And that is a true statement. So one of the aspects of the NEMA 250 test is a rod test. And it's really pretty much like it sounds. You try to stick a different diameter of rod into the hole in the enclosure. Some enclosures actually have holes in them already. NEMA 1, 2, and 3R, those actually have holes in them that somebody could stick something conductive into. So we'll take a look at the rod test next. So here's a couple of different types of tests. First, you have non-ventilated enclosures, and there's a probe with a diameter of 1/8 of an inch will not fit in an opening with enclosures with live parts located less than 4 inches, and a probe with a diameter of 1/2 inch won't fit in the opening with enclosures live parts located more than 4 inches from the opening. So a couple of different criteria there. And then you also have ventilated enclosures. And if you look at the picture on the slide, that top picture is an example of a ventilated enclosure. And again, a couple of criteria for live parts that are less than 4 inches or more than 4 inches from the opening. So it's, again, that's for personnel protection in case somebody does stick something conductive into one of those openings. Next. So if you look at Table 110.28 in the NEC, there are also some supplemental markings. So again, we're going to go over all the different enclosure types, but there are, if you look at the informational notes at the bottom of Table 110.28, there's some terms in there that refer to the different enclosure types. And some of these are actually defined back in Article 100 in the NEC for definitions. But first you have drip tight, and that's where falling dirt or moisture will not enter the enclosure. And you have dust tight, and where circulating or airborne dust will not enter the enclosure. And this is often Class 2 hazardous locations have to do with combustible dust. So again, this would be for types 3, 3X, 4, 5, 6, 12, and 13. And those typically have some kind of a gasket that'll keep that dust out. And then you have rainproof. And rainproof is where exposure to beating rain will not interfere with the operation of the apparatus or result in wetting of live parts and wiring within the enclosure. So those types of enclosures, 3R, 3RX, all the different type 3s, your type 4s, and your 6, those are all rainproof. And one important note to consider with this is that it won't keep the rain out of the enclosure. And 3Rs are very, very typical. We're going to talk about these more. 3R is a very typical example of an enclosure that is rainproof, but it doesn't mean that the water is not going to get into the enclosure. What it means is that if water does get into the enclosure, it won't get the live parts wet and it won't interfere with the operation of the apparatus. So again, a 3R is very typical for residential service equipment, all types of service equipment, and so on and so forth. So next slide, please. So rain tight is different than rainproof. And again, these are in Article 100 for definitions. And this is where exposure to beating rain will not result in the entrance of water. So water is not going to get into one of these types of enclosures, even if it's a beating rain, high wind, whatever. So that's your type 3, 3X, your 4s, your 6s. But again, 3R is not in this category. So that's an important aspect to note. And then watertight. Watertight is different than rain tight. Watertight is where water will not enter the enclosure when subjected to a stream of water. So that's your type 4s and your type 6s. And type 4s are very commonly used in areas, say, for example, food processing facilities where the equipment needs to be hosed down at the end of the day to clean things up. That's where you're going to run into a type 4 type of an enclosure. The water's not going to get into the enclosure even if you're hosing it down. And those are typically going to have a pretty robust gasket around them. And then corrosion resistant, that designates an increased level of protection against corrosion. So if you look at any of your enclosure types that they have an X designation after them, that refers to the corrosion resistant. And we're going to talk a little bit about these more later. And then damp locations, again, that's the definition in Article 100 for different types of enclosures. And your wet locations also are installations underground, in concrete, in direct contact with the earth, or locations subject to saturation with water or other liquids, typically weather tight. Next slide, please. So your type ratings, again, we're going to start off with our type 1 enclosures. Go ahead to the next slide. And so a type 1 enclosure, this is an indoor use enclosure. It's general purpose. You see these all over the place. They're not exposed to unusual conditions. Again, they're for indoor use only. And they're going to protect against, as all enclosure types, they're going to protect against contact with live parts, and they provide a degree of protection from falling dirt. So if you look at this picture, this is a real typical example. It looks like some type of an industrial application. You have your raceways entering the top of the enclosure. A lot of times your type 1 enclosures will have knockouts all the way around them that that can be punched out, or you can punch your own knockouts. But again, they're not approved for any type of a wet location. Next slide, please. So a type 2 enclosure is maybe a step above a type 1 enclosure. Again, it's for indoor use only. And this picture here is a real typical example. This is a dry type transformer. Those typically come already installed in a type 2 enclosure. And it provides a degree of protection from falling dirt, just like a type 1, but it also protects somewhat against dripping non-corrosive liquids and light splashing of non-corrosive liquids. And a real typical example of where you might want to have a type 2 enclosure would be, say, in a cold storage warehouse, where you're going to have some condensation, where it's going to result in a little bit of dripping liquid, but it's not like a beating rain or anything like that, or hose down, anything like that. Go ahead to the next slide, please. So here's the actual test of a type 2 enclosure. And again, it protects against the ingress of water from dripping and light splashing. So the test is it drips water at a rate of at least 20 drops per minute. And the test has a 30-minute duration. And the criteria for passing that test is that no water gets inside of that enclosure. Next slide, please.
Type 3 enclosures provide solid outdoor grade protection in a variety of styles and feature sets. While the Type 3 is also suitable for indoor use, It provides a degree of protection from falling dirt, rain, sleet, snow, and windblown dust. Additionally, it remains undamaged by external formation of ice. Over the series of next slides, we're also going to explore different variations of the Type 3 enclosure, as well as test methods employed to meet those designations. As mentioned previously, the X designation is for enhanced corrosion resistance for such applications of coastal areas or caustic industrial installations. It's also important to note that what the Type 3 enclosure doesn't protect against would be hose-directed water jets, temporary or prolonged submersion, explosion, or impacts, unless the enclosure has the IK impact rating. Next. The enclosure model Type 3R and 3RX ratings are similar to the Type 3 discussed previously, but with two key differences. 3R and 3RX enclosures don't offer protection against windblown dust found in other Type 3 enclosures. 3R and 3RX enclosures are also include a small drainage hole to prevent liquid accumulation within the enclosure. If the environmental conditions don't dictate the need to protect from airborne particles, a Type 3R or a 3RX enclosure would be sufficient. So again, the 3R or 3RX provides the same level of protection as the Type 3 enclosure, except no protection from the dust, and also includes provision for drainage. Next. This slide here illustrates the testing that a 3R and 3RX enclosure must endure in order to receive that designation. The top two photos show the test laboratory with these three spray nozzles located at 45-degree angle and proper distance, as well as the nozzle pressure. Criteria for passing the test does recognize water can enter the enclosure. However, this entry occurs below the electrical part location and does not impact the electrical performance. Further discussion with drainage will be on the next slide. Next. Type 2, 3R, and 3RX enclosures are required to have provisions for drainage. Per the NEMA 250 standard, NEMA drainage openings shall not be less than 1/8 inch in diameter or more than 1/4 inch in diameter unless baffled or provided with a drainage fitting. Section 314.15 was added to the 2014 NEC to address field installed drainage openings. Another resource addressing drainage can also be found by visiting NEMA.org, selecting the Standards tab, and then selecting the Engineering Bulletins, which there are several bulletins published on the website, provides guidance on various products. While Bulletin 110, titled Drain Openings and Boxes and Conduit Bodies listed for damp or wet locations, provide guidance on drilling drainage holes. Next. Type 3S and 3SX is the same as the Type 3 enclosure, except the key difference is the external mechanism remains operable when ice-laden. It meets the degree of personnel protection for falling dirt and wind-blown dust, ingress of water, such as rain, sleet, or snow, but unlike the 3 or the 3R, which only requires the external formation of ice will not damage the enclosure, the 3S or the 3SX requires the mechanism to remain operable when ice-laden. And as illustrated in the slide, the operating handle, despite it will be ice-laden, will still operate. Next. Type 4 enclosures are intended mainly for outdoor use where extra protection against moisture and wind-driven rain is required, or indoors in a hose-down environment due to its design and corrosion-resistant properties. The key difference between the Type 3 and the Type 4 is a Type 4 adds protection against hose-directed water. NEMA 4 enclosures are often used in applications where equipment is sprayed or washed with a hose, particularly when a pressurized stream of water is used. They also have a gasketed sealed surface as well as a clamp door for maximum sealing. These types of enclosures are often used in petrochemical facilities as well as food processing applications where equipment must be washed with disinfectants on a regular basis. When I worked in the trade as an electrician, one example is we did a lot of work in Frito-Lay plants in my hometown of Worcester, Ohio, and the specification for the types of enclosures in those facilities was the NEMA 4X. Also, another application for a Type 4X would be at a swimming pool under section 680.14, where you would have corrosive environments. Next. This slide illustrates the testing criteria for a Type 4 enclosure. In contrast to the Type 3 test, the Type 4 provides that hose down test. Additionally, past criteria reveals no water infiltration inside the enclosure. So the desired rate of movement of the stream of water in accordance with the NEMA standard is 1/4 of an inch per second along the test joint. Additionally, a NEMA Type 4 or 4X enclosure may also be marked with the words rain tight, rainproof, watertight, drip tight, or dust tight. And again, the 4X stands for the corrosion resistance. Next. The focus with a Type 5 enclosure is ensuring they are dust proof. They are provided with gaskets or equivalent to exclude dust and are used commonly in steel mills and cement plants. While it does include testing and specification in regard to water and is equivalent to the Type 2, it would be rare to actually see a Type 5 enclosure installed outside. Again, the focus with the Type 5 enclosure is ensuring that they are dust proof. Next.
So we get into Type 6 enclosures, and on the screen you'll see a list of what these things are designed to protect from. They're both rated indoor and outdoor, but they protect from falling dirt, hose-directed water, the ice formation, making sure there's no damage to the enclosure. But the real gist of the Type 6 enclosures is the temporary or prolonged use underwater and preventing water from entering the enclosure. So suitable for indoor, outdoor, provides protection from entry for temporary or prolonged. And the test function or the test process that you're going to look at is a Type 6 is submerged in 6 feet of water and for 30 minutes. Type 6P, the P is prolonged. So that would be 6 feet of water for 24 hours. And both criteria would be making sure no water gets inside the enclosure. So what is the weakest link here is what's connected to the box. A raceway system, maybe a cord and a watertight connector for a cord. You may see these in fountains where you would have underwater lighting and a distribution junction box in the water. These would provide the watertight seal from the water to the inside of the enclosure. So there are possibilities of sealing off your raceways for getting water inside that. So where would you use these? Around the river where you'd get flooding, possible flooding, or those other maybe artificial ponds or fountain areas. So next slide, please. In the Type 7 enclosures, these are indoor locations. These are listed, or they're Type 7 rated. They have an environmental rating for it, but they also are evaluated under UL 1203 for Class 1 environments. They protect against, they have protection in hazardous locations for gases and vapors. So we have different categories of the Type 7 enclosures, whether it be gas groups A through D, A being acetylene, the most volatile. But in all of these things, you have indoor locations, but these are not allowed to have knockouts in these enclosures. Polymeric enclosures installed and classified must meet buildup of static electricity, so they have to be evaluated for that. This includes polymeric parts of metal enclosures coated with a polymeric material. Gaskets may also require additional evaluation when used in a Type 7 enclosure. Thank you. Next slide. In a Type 9, you have a dust ignition proof enclosure. Now this is also indoor. We look at what is the Type 8. There's actually a Type 8 that goes in there. It's an outdoor for that gas location, but this Type 9 is an indoor, and now we're getting into dust Class 2 environments. And we also have different types of classes for the dusts, whether it's group E, F, or G, depending on what is the ignition point of those dusts. So all of these things have been evaluated to 1203, but they have this environmental protection included in it also. They're electrically conductive for these type Group E dusts are electrically conductive dusts and require enclosure to be evaluated for a Class 2 Division 1 requirement. Enclosures rated Class 2 Div 2 are not suitable for Group E dust. So all of these things you have to be looked at. Knockouts are not permitted in Type 9 enclosures. Next. In a Type 12 indoor use, primarily provide protection against circulating dust, falling dirt, dripping corrosive liquids, and all the lints and fibers you're going to see in and possibly a Type 3 Class 3 location. But those provide that. You have two different types: Type 12, Type 12K, which provides knockouts in this enclosure, primarily in use protection against all of those conditions. And you'll see that this type of dust type enclosure can be used if you look at the footnotes in 11028 that was referenced earlier. All of those, Class 2, Div 2, Class 3, all of those sections where they call for a dust type box is all you need. This type of enclosure is suitable for that. Next. In a Type 13, now we're looking at now our wireways, and we look at indoor and outdoor use, and now we're going to add this condition of oil and coolant. So we're looking more for machine shop applications where you're getting sprayed with oil or some coolant material. You notice the gaskets on all of these wireways. They provide all of those protections for the interior of the wireway. So the gaskets are evaluated for the oil resistance protection that you're looking for. Next. The ancillary ratings for enclosures is a fairly new nomenclature that they're going to use for power wash and additional evaluations. These ratings do not change or modify any of the type ratings in any manner. they add an additional level of description to the standards for more methods of evaluation. These ratings are added to the current type rating as needed. So we're going to see 12 PW, 4 PW, 3 PW, all of these things. And we look at power wash and what is power wash referred to quite often in the National Electrical Code, in Article 300, 352, 406, all of these things use that term power wash and making sure the equipment is suitable for those environments. Next. In this slide here, you'll see a test procedure for a power wash. What are we going to do? Hot water, a hot water, high pressure power wash is duplication of the ANSI IEC 60529 test. Got a flow rate, water temperature, the distance from the spray nozzle to the test sample, enclosure rate in all practical directions, and you have a time limit, all that. And what's the result? You pass it if there's no water inside. So all of these things make up the power wash ancillary test. Next, please. Okay, the NEMA construction requirements. All right, we have additional tests we're going to look at: polymeric enclosures, the corrosion resistance, indoor, outdoor, increased level of protection against corrosion, and the gasket materials for these polymeric enclosures. So these are some of the additional tests that we're going to look at when we're starting to get into non-metallic enclosures. Go ahead. Next slide. And some of the examples we're going to look at is the crush test. How we see this picture, we have some examples of exerting pressure on the cover for these boxes, make sure they don't deform. We put them through different weights, different time durations to make sure the gaskets hold up, the covers hold up. And so this is just some of the criteria for that test. This is in addition to maybe a ground box that has some sort of tier rating, whether it's a ground box that can be put into a sidewalk or a driveway. They've got tier ratings. Well, this is not that. This is just a typical polymeric construction rating that we're looking at. But that's the construction test that additionally we have to go through, not just looking at the environmental protection that a non-metallic enclosure provides for corrosion. So next, please.
So quite a few times we've mentioned corrosion protection, and actually all of your various NEMA type enclosures all have to have some degree of corrosion protection, and there's really 3 levels. So first is your indoor, that'd be your general purpose type 1 enclosures, your 12 and 13 dust tight enclosures. Those have to be enameled or galvanized or plated. Typically, real typical is you're going to see them actually painted with enamel. That's very, very common. And your second level of protection would be for outdoor enclosures, and this would be your 3R, your 4 enclosures that are subject to hose down, your 6 that are submersible, and those have a little bit of a higher level of protection that's required. I'm not going to go through all the different types of G90 paint and G60 paint and all that, but real typical, if you look at a piece of outdoor service equipment, which is typically 3R, it's going to be painted, and that paint is going to have some kind of extra level of zinc that's in it that will give it a higher level of protection than just a typical type 1 indoor enclosure. And then your third level of protection would be your outdoor corrosive environments. And this would be any of your enclosure types that have that X designation. They're actually, the actual material of the enclosure is going to be corrosive resistant. So some real typical examples are stainless steel. Those are the actual material of the enclosure itself is resistant to corrosive environments. And then polymeric, that's your non-metallic, could be fiberglass, could be PVC. And also you could have aluminum enclosures. There's some types of environments, corrosive environments, specialized chemicals. There's all different types of corrosive environments, and some materials work better than others depending on what the pH level is. So again, with your type X, anything with a type X, it's going to be the actual material of the enclosure itself that's corrosion resistant. Next slide, please. So here's just an example of how the corrosion resistance is tested. You've got this piece of equipment here where the enclosure is put in the test machine, and it has to meet certain criteria: no pitting, cracking, other deterioration. So if you do select, for example, a type 4 enclosure or a type 3R enclosure, this is the type of a test that it would have to be submitted to in order to get that designation. Next slide, please. And also your gaskets are tested. Again, they're submerged in oil for 70 hours. There's also some temperature type requirements in there as well, and they have to meet swell and shrink requirements, to pass the test. So this is important if you have an existing enclosure and you need to replace the gasket. You can't just go get a piece of rubber or some silicone seal to seal that thing up. These gaskets are actually tested to particular criteria that they have to meet. Next slide, please. And another criteria is your sharp edge testing. And this tests for your sheet metal edges of enclosures. And this is obviously, you don't want wires to have the insulation stripped off of them because you're putting them in an enclosure with sharp edges. So that's part of it. But also another part of this test is personnel protection. You don't want electricians or whoever's getting in that enclosure, you don't want them to be taking the skin off their knuckles. And so that's another important aspect of this test that enclosures have to be subjected to. Next slide, please.
Up until this point, our discussion has revolved around the different types of enclosures specified by the NEMA 250 standard. There's another standard published by the International Electrotechnical Commission, IEC 60529, which is a standard that describes a system for classifying degrees of protection provided by an enclosure. The IP designation only addresses requirements for protection of people, ingress of solid objects, and ingress of water, whereas NEMA types are much broader. As such, IP designations cannot be used as a substitute for NEMA enclosure types. This table can be found in Annex A of the NEMA 250 standard for comparison between the NEMA enclosure type ratings and the IEC standard ingress protection ratings. You can also go to the enclosure webpage on NEMA's website, and there you'll find a document titled Brief Comparison of NEMA 250 and IEC 60529 that includes this table along with helpful commentary. Next slide, please. This slide presents a question. Can more than one NEMA type rating apply to a single enclosure? And the answer to that is yes. Enclosures that meet requirements for more than one type rating may be designated by a combination of type numbers, with the smallest number being given first. The designation may include a combination of indoor, outdoor, hazardous location, and non-hazardous location ratings if they apply. This example shows an enclosure with several enclosure type ratings. Those include type 4 and 4X for enhanced corrosion and hose down, type 12 and 5 for industrial environments with oily and settling airborne dust, lint, fibers, and flyings, and also a Type 3 rating that has a drain hole accessory in cases where the enclosure is derated. If you default to the 3R rating, the drain plug would then need to be removed. Otherwise, the drain plug would need to remain in place to maintain the higher enclosure type rating. Next, please.
For more information on enclosures, you can go to the UL Product IQ webpage. This is now your search engine for looking at the categories for all of the electrical products, but the UL guide cards for enclosures are incorporated into AALZ, BGUZ, CYIV, or BGHL. You can type those into your search and they will get you to those product categories and give you more information on enclosures. But the additional, as Tim mentioned earlier, you go to the NEMA enclosure section on the NEMA webpage, nema.org. Will send you to the products. And under the products inside NEMA, you will see a building infrastructure tab. And under that tab, you will see enclosures. And that will bring you to all of the documents that we've referenced today, and also some frequently asked question sheets on enclosures and applications. Next, please. So we want to thank the 5EN section members. 5EN is our enclosure section within the NEMA product scope. And you'll see the list on the screen of all of the participants in 5EN that helped put together the slides for this presentation, which I hope gave you a good example, good explanation of the NEMA type enclosure rating system. Next.
Thank you for joining us for the NEMA Field Representative Training Program on NEMA 250 standard for enclosures for electrical equipment up to 1,000 volts. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to any of the 4 field representatives. Their contact information is shown on the screen. Please also let us know if you have any suggestions for future training programs.